investigations on the Hondas that are out there.
I would hate to live right there next to a homeless a homeless encampment. You know what I mean?
Tonight, the FBI is stepping up its efforts to counter the shocking surge in attacks on Asian Americans. They've skyrocketed in the past year as some falsely blame Asians for the pandemic. We get more on this from CBS's Jeff Begays.
In New York City, police are investigating a hammer attack on an Asian woman that was caught on surveillance video. In Baltimore, a man wielding a cement block attacked two Korean women simply trying to close down their store. The number of brazen attacks on Asians is rising across the country.
As I was doing homework, I heard my mom call my name from outside. When I went to open the door for her, she wasn't there. Instead, I saw her limp on the ground with blood on her face. When I rushed over, she said that a man pushed her from behind out of nowhere. After I realized that the perpetrator had left all of her belongings there, that's when I realized that everything I've been hearing in the news was no longer just something on my screen. It has become a reality. My mom was a victim of anti-Asian racism, and I could be next. There was nothing I could do but call the police. 2 months later, I was waiting in front of my friend's house at 11 a.m. in the morning. Suddenly, a violent tug pulled me backwards. Before I knew it, I was on the ground and 3 men in ski masks had surrounded me, trying to take my bag. Instinctively, I fought back without thinking. I kicked and held on. It was only when they had begun to pull me towards the road that I let them have my stuff. Looking back, things could have ended way worse than it did. But it feels horrible that I have to feel lucky that I wasn't killed.
A substitute in one of my classes once mentioned, "We all know you Asians are rich and own a Mercedes-Benz." Growing up, I witnessed my parents' struggles trying to maintain their health while shouldering many responsibilities. My father's hands had become rough and calloused from years of intensive labor. My mother's legs had slowed from long hours of standing and needing to move from one customer to the next. Whenever my dad picked me up from school, I would ask about his day. Each time, the response was always the same. All he could think about was how tired he was from work. There were numerous occasions where I've seen my mother come home ill or weary from working several hours continuously. During these times, I recall feeling scared and most of all helpless. The way my teacher stereotyped Asians made me feel like my experiences and struggles were invalid. It began around March of 2020. One day at school, I was in my seat trying to finish my classwork as quickly as possible and head home right after. Around that time, one of my classmates pulled out their cell phone that displayed a video of an Asian elderly man getting assaulted by a group of people and being thrown racist remarks and slurs. As I watched the video, I suddenly imagined my father or mother being in that position, and a sense of dread that I hadn't felt before I was born. Without realizing it, what had once been home for me gradually became my only safe haven from these events. What had once been fear had become a repetitive pattern of locking doors and keeping window blinds closed. What had once been rage had turned to desensitization after witnessing multiple anti-Asian hate crimes on news television. What had once been a possibility led to having to wait in a hospital for several hours until my mother was finally treated.
We are in a moment of reckoning right now. We're in an inflection point, and that's thanks to literally millions of people who felt like for the first time they could speak openly about the racism and grief that they've experienced as an AAPI. That's also thanks to the millions of people who in other communities decided to stand in solidarity. Peace is not the absence of visible conflict. In order for there to be true peace, we need to hold a light to the darkest corner of human experience. And right now, that is what the AAPI is experiencing.
Growing up, I was taught that expressing your trauma and fear was what made you weak. Over time, I subconsciously internalized these ideas. I began to perceive my fear and trauma as a lesser part of myself. I learned to accept these injustices quietly and not speak about them. These issues followed me around every day of my life, and I gradually became desensitized to them without realizing it. After seeing multiple reports of anti-Asian hate crimes on news television, I even began to dismiss it as a normal occurrence. That's when it finally struck me. When had my fear and trauma as an Asian American become normal to me? After the day my mother was assaulted, it felt like a wake-up call. I had to truly come to terms with the fact that the fear I once had was no longer simply a possibility or something I would see on news television. It had happened, and the only thing I felt I could do in the moment was accept it and be more careful when I went outside. It was one of the first times in my life I ever felt alienated, and even months later after the incident, I was afraid to speak about it. Making this film about my trauma as an Asian American seemed completely foreign and even scary to me. My first thought was, how could I write about my trauma and emotions when I already had a difficult time expressing these experiences to other people? However, this fear around speaking about my trauma wasn't just an experience I had, but what many other Asian Americans in my community share as well. Rather than suppressing these thoughts and emotions, I realized I could create a story and help make an impact in my community by empowering and amplifying the voices of others who are going through similar experiences.
I have countless stories of the times my family has experienced violence, whether it was in our neighborhood, at school, or even McDonald's. It never felt like something we could truly escape. It felt like the wrong time in the wrong place each and every single time. The more I experienced the violence, I came to feel like it was normal, that it was what it was. But when I experienced it firsthand, alone, I felt a type of weakness I'd never felt before. I felt weak not because I wasn't fit or physically built, but I felt weak because of my identity. No matter what, I couldn't erase the thought from my mind that the reason I was attacked was because I was who I was, Asian, and that made me an easy target. I was never taught to speak up. I was never taught to make sure my voice was heard when it needed to be. In my family, it felt like my role was to get what I needed to get done without causing unnecessary trouble that would otherwise come if I brought attention to myself by saying things I didn't need to say. But seeing videos of so many people speaking up from their experiences, trying to empower their families, friends, and communities made me realize how much power my voice and story had, and how much I wanted to use that power, not only as a way to empower others, but to heal myself. My identity doesn't make me weak, but it is a reason to fight against the stereotypes set upon me to be passive. As an Asian American, I see courage in reaching for what has been decided as impossible for me. I see resilience in speaking up and standing together when our bodies, lives, and futures are on the line, and where I will empower everyone unempowered for justice and equality, for my community, my family, and me.